All right, let's dive into this pile of stuff about Roku, shall we? Looks like we've got financial reports, stock analyses, even some legal documents about employee stock options.
Someone's really trying to get a handle on Roku.
Yeah, they want to understand, like, how Roku actually makes money and where they might be headed, in the future.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've got some excerpts from Roku's own 10K and 10Q filings here.
How?
So we can get into the nitty-gritty, like their financials and the risks they're dealing with.
And what they're planning,
Their
remember?
plans for the future. Exactly. Oh, and we've got that stock analysis from Insider Monkey, too. Should be interesting.
Definitely.
Uh-huh.
Especially for anyone thinking about, investing.
Exactly.
Okay, so first things first, I think we got to talk about Roku's business model. It's not just selling those little streaming boxes anymore, is it?
No, not at all. They've got like this two-pronged approach now. You got to understand that if you want to know where they're going.
Okay, so break it down for us.
All right, so on the one hand, you have what they call platform revenue.
Okay.
That's mainly from advertising and like the cut they take when people subscribe to stuff.
Through Roku. Right.
Right, like if
Well,
you sign up for Netflix through Roku.
Yeah.
Or if you rent a movie on, Amazon Prime through Roku, they get a piece of that.
Makes sense.
And that's where they're seeing the most growth, actually. It's way more scalable than the other side of their business,
The device revenue,
right.
the actual boxes and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. The players, the TVs, even smart home products now.
They've branched out.
They have. But here's the thing, and this is kind of wild. Sometimes they actually lower their profit margins on those devices.
Really?
On purpose. Just to get more users.
Wow.
It's a gamble, right? The bet is that once people are hooked on the Roku experience, they'll make more money from them on the platform side.
I mean, it's classic land and expand, get them in the door with the device, then make money off the services. But, I mean, is it a risky move?
I mean, it could be.
It's a crowded market out there. I mean,
Yeah.
can they really compete with, like, Google and Amazon for ad dollars? Especially if they're keeping device prices low.
That's the question.
And do they even have, like, enough unique features to pull people away from those other ecosystems? I mean, what do you think about this approach, listener?
Right. Risky move or a stroke of genius.
We want to know.
Because they are seeing impressive growth. The sources show, like, their active accounts, the streaming hours, it's all going up.
It is.
But the competition's no joke.
Right.
Everyone wants our eyeballs,
They do. And there's some pretty specific risks for Roku, too, right?
Oh, for sure.
Like, they rely a lot on companies like Amazon to actually sell their devices,
A
right?
huge risk there.
I mean, what if they lose a major partner like that?
Yeah, it could be a real blow. Shows you just how vulnerable they are. And then there's always the threat of, like, cybersecurity breaches, data privacy issues.
Oh, yeah, that stuff can really damage a company.
Big time. Costly legal battles, loss of trust, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah. So even though they've come a long way, it's clear that Roku's still facing some serious obstacles. So let's get into their financial health. I mean, how are they actually doing when we look at the numbers?
All right, let's crack open those 10K and 10Q reports. One thing that jumps out, right away is that while their revenue has been growing, profitability is, well, it's a bit bumpy.
Bumpy how?
Well, they've actually lost money in the past. And the profits, when they do come, they can fluctuate quite a bit.
Huh. Is that just because they're still a relatively young company, like investing a lot in growth?
Could be.
Or are there, like, bigger concerns about them actually making consistent profits?
It's a good question.
I don't know if the sources give us a clear answer on that.
They don't really.
Something to think about, listener.
Definitely. But one thing that definitely makes their finances more complex is these things called content liabilities.
Content liabilities. That sounds concerning.
Yeah. Basically, it means they've made these agreements to pay for content in the future,
Okay.
even if that content doesn't do well. Oh, I see.
Like, it could end up paying a ton
Yeah,
for a show that nobody watches.
that's a risk.
It is.
Yeah.
And it can really limit what they can do financially down the line.
I mean, they are pouring a lot of resources into their own content, right? The Roku channel.
They are.
It's a big gamble.
It is.
Could pay off huge, but it's definitely a gamble.
And that goes for their international expansion, too.
Oh, yeah.
They're pushing hard into markets outside the U.S., but there's no guarantee they can replicate the success they've had here. I mean, different cultures, different regulations.
It's just a whole different ballgame.
It is.
So lots of potential for growth, but definitely some big risks as well. It's like they're walking a tightrope between like innovation and actually staying afloat financially.
Good analogy.
But before we get into all that, I kind of want to peek behind the curtain a little bit. See how Roku is trying to, attract and keep talented people in such a competitive industry.
Ah, yeah. The employee stock options.
Smart move? Pretty common in tech, especially for companies growing as fast as Roku.
So basically, they're offering employees a chance to buy company stock at a certain price,
Exactly.
hoping it'll, like, incentivize them to help the company succeed, right? The stock goes up, the options are worth more.
Everyone wins, ideally.
Makes sense.
Mm.
But then there's this whole other thing, Roku's dual-class stock structure.
Ah, right.
Their founder, Anthony Wood, seems to have a lot of control over the company, even though he doesn't own most of the shares.
Right. It's this structure that gives him a lot of voting power.
So he can kind of do what he wants, even if other shareholders disagree.
Pretty much. Lets him pursue his vision, even if it gets bumpy.
I mean, that could be good or bad, depending on how you look at it.
For sure.
Investors are basically betting on his vision, and that can be risky.
No doubt.
So we've covered a lot already. Roku's business model, their growth, the challenges they're up against, and even how their ownership is structured.
Mm.
Seems pretty clear that they've got a lot of potential.
Yeah, tons.
But a lot of risks, too.
Definitely.
They've done really well so far. But the tech world is constantly changing. And as we dig into these legal and regulatory hurdles they're dealing with, it'll become even clearer just how complex this journey is for them.
Definitely lots to unpack there.
All right, so we're back, and we're ready to get into some of the legal and regulatory stuff that Roku's dealing with.
Yeah, it can get pretty hairy, especially as they're trying to, expand internationally.
Yeah, more countries, more rules.
Exactly. And one thing that really jumps out from these sources is these things called data localization laws.
Data localization.
Yeah, basically some countries are saying like, hey, if you collect data on our citizens, you got to store that data within our borders.
So Roku can't just have, like, one big database for everybody.
Not necessarily. They might have to set up separate data centers in all these different countries.
Which I imagine is expensive and complicated.
Oh yeah, big time. Adds a whole extra layer of complexity to going global. And it really highlights how important it is for them to, really understand the ins and outs of each market they're going into.
Yeah, you can't just assume everything's going to work the same way everywhere.
Nope. What flies in one place might be totally illegal in another. It's a minefield out there.
And data localization is just one piece of it, right? What other legal challenges do they face going global?
Well, protecting their intellectual property is a big one.
Yeah, makes sense. They've got their patents, trademarks, all that stuff.
Right. And like we saw in that document about employee stock options, they're really serious about confidentiality agreements.
Trying to keep their secret sauce, well, secret.
Exactly. But it's tough, Information travels fast these days.
Yeah, it's going to be a constant battle to keep everything under wraps, especially with all these partners and new markets and everything.
For sure. And speaking of partners, their relationships with all those content providers, that's another legal minefield.
Right, because Roku doesn't actually make most of the stuff people watch on their platform.
Right. They're more like a middleman connecting viewers with all these different shows and movies.
Like a giant entertainment marketplace.
Yeah, exactly. And like any marketplace, there are rules, contracts, the whole 9 yards. Roku has to negotiate deals with all these providers. And that can get really tricky.
What kind of deals are we talking about here?
Well, like revenue sharing agreements.
Mm.
How much of the pie does Roku get when someone subscribes to, say, Netflix through their platform?
Okay.
Or, how much ad space does Roku get to sell within those channels
So they need those content providers, obviously.
to get people using Roku?
But they also need to make sure they're getting a decent cut for themselves.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance. And the power dynamics can shift depending on how popular a provider is. Like a company like Netflix, they have a lot of leverage. They can kind of dictate terms.
Roku's got to be smart about it.
Oh, yeah, I got to play the game right.
It's like a constant chess match,
It is.
trying to stay one step ahead.
Right. And it's not just the big guys like Netflix they have to worry about. Competition's coming from everywhere.
Yeah, we talked about Amazon and Google, right?
But there's also Apple, Samsung, all with their own streaming devices and TVs. And gaming consoles, too, like Xbox and PlayStation. They're getting in on the streaming action.
Oh, yeah. I use my PlayStation to watch Netflix all the time. I never even thought about that being competition for Roku.
It's everywhere. And then you have the content providers themselves, like Netflix, Disney, HBO. They're all pushing their own streaming platforms, too. So Roku's getting squeezed from both sides.
It's wild. So how do they even stand out in such a crowded market?
Well, one way is with their own content. The Roku channel is becoming a big part of their strategy.
Right. They're making their own shows, licensing stuff, trying to make it a destination for viewers.
Right. It's not just about free content either. It gives them more control over the ads, and that's crucial for their revenue.
Making content is expensive.
Very.
Adds even more legal stuff to think about too, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Making sure they have the rights to distribute it, complying with copyright laws, managing those content liabilities we talked about.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. And then there's the whole data privacy issue.
Oh, yeah. That's huge these days.
I mean, Roku collects a ton of data about us, right?
Right.
What we watch, how long we watch it, what we click on. They got to be careful with that.
Big fines if they mess up.
Yeah. Lawsuits, damage to their reputation. It's not just a legal risk, it's a business risk.
So yeah, the legal and regulatory stuff, it's a minefield for Roku.
Especially going global.
But it's not just about avoiding landmines, right?
No, it's about navigating this complex landscape strategically to get where they want to go.
And speaking of where they want to go, let's talk about that international expansion a little more.
Yeah.
Going global, that's not just about, like, flipping a switch.
No, it's a huge undertaking.
All sorts of new challenges.
Starting with language, even.
Yeah.
Roku's whole interface, all the content, it's got to be translated, adapted for different cultures. The user experience needs to be smooth.
You can't just assume everyone speaks English.
Nope. And even if they do, cultural references might not land the same way. It's got to feel natural to each market.
So, lots of research involved, I imagine.
Oh, yeah. Tons of market analysis. They got to become experts in global entertainment trends.
What people are watching, what they like.
Exactly. And then they need to build relationships with content providers in those regions, advertisers, distributors. It's all about establishing partnerships, understanding different business cultures.
So it's really building an entire ecosystem in each new place.
Right. It's much more than just translating the website.
And what about the technical side of things? Can their servers even handle all the extra traffic?
That's a good point. The infrastructure's got to be there. Nobody wants to wait forever for a show to load.
No matter where they are in the world.
Exactly. And they got to make sure the servers are located strategically, too, to minimize lag and buffering.
And then, of course, there's how people actually pay for stuff.
Yeah.
Not every country uses credit cards the way we do here.
Right. Mobile payments, cash-based systems, they got to make sure it all integrates smoothly.
Customer support, right. Got to have people who speak the language available at the right times.
Absolutely. It's all part of the global experience.
So yeah, going global, it's a complex beast. Lots of moving pieces.
But it's essential for their growth.
The U.S. market is getting pretty crowded.
They need to find new audiences if they want to keep growing. New sources of revenue.
Like planting seeds in new territories, hoping they take root.
A good analogy.
Before we move on, though, I want to circle back to their content strategy for a second. We talked about the Roku channel.
Right.
But they're not just making their own stuff, right?
No, they're bringing together content from all sorts of different providers.
Like a giant buffet?
Yeah, something for everyone. Blockbusters, documentaries, live sports, the whole deal.
And they got to keep it fresh.
Oh, yeah. New releases, trending shows. It's got to be constantly updated. It's a dynamic landscape.
Keep people entertained, keep them coming back.
That's the name of the game.
And that brings us to the final act in our Roku deep dive.
The grand finale.
Where we'll dig into their financials a little deeper, see what risks and opportunities they're facing, and try to figure out where they might be headed in the future.
It's been a wild ride so far.
Okay, so we've talked about Roku's business, the competition, the legal stuff, going global, all of that. But now, let's get to the heart of it. The money. How are they actually doing financially?
Right, because at the end of the day, that's what matters, isn't it? And the numbers paint, well, a pretty interesting picture. We've got growth for sure, but there are definitely some challenges in there too. Remember how we talked about those two main revenue streams, platform and device?
Yeah, the hardware versus the software side of things.
Exactly. And when you look at the reports, it's clear that platform revenue, the stuff from advertising and content deals, that's where they're really killing it.
It's growing faster than the device revenue, right?
Yeah.
The actual boxes and stuff.
Way faster. And it's a lot more scalable too, you know? That recurring revenue, that's what everyone's after these days. It's the same trend you see across the whole tech industry. Software and services, that's where the money is.
So the big question is, can they keep that momentum going on the platform side? Especially with all the competition out there.
That's the million-dollar question, right? And to answer it, we got to look beyond just how much money they're bringing in. And we got to talk about profit, because we saw earlier that, well, Roku hasn't always been profitable.
They've had some ups and downs, right?
They have. And they're still investing a lot in growth, which can eat into profits in the short term.
But they are getting better at managing their costs, right? their operating margin is improving.
It is, which is a good sign. It shows they're figuring out how to grow without spending recklessly. But the competition's fierce out there. You've got companies like Amazon, Google. They can afford to operate on razor-thin margins.
Because they've got other businesses bringing in tons of cash.
Exactly. Roku doesn't have that luxury. They've got to find that balance. Grow the user base, keep prices competitive, and still make enough profit to fuel their ambitions. It's a tightrope walk for sure.
Speaking of which, I noticed something interesting in the reports
Mm.
about how they're using debt. They've got this credit facility, right?
Hmm.
Like a line of credit they can tap into. Is that a red flag?
Not necessarily. Lots of companies use debt strategically, especially when they're growing fast. But it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Debt always comes with strings attached. Interest payments, obligations, all that fun stuff.
It can limit what they can do down the line.
Exactly. And then, of course, there are those content liabilities we talked about, those agreements to pay for content, even if it flops.
Yeah, that's always a risk in the streaming world.
It is. They're making a bet that the content they're investing in will attract enough users to make it worthwhile. But it's a gamble for sure.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Roku, what's the main takeaway? What should our listener be thinking about as they, continue to research this company?
Well, I think the big picture here is that Roku's at a crossroads. They've had a lot of success, but they're in a super competitive space, and things are changing fast. Can they keep innovating? Can they keep attracting users? Can they navigate this crazy world of streaming? Those are the questions.
We've covered a lot today. Their business, the challenges, the opportunities, the whole shebang. Any final thoughts?
One thing that really struck me is how important the Roku channel has become. It's not just about offering free content anymore. It's a big part of their strategy, a way to stand out from the crowd, and a potential gold mine for revenue. So if you're watching Roku, watch the Roku channel. It might just tell you where they're headed.
That's a great point. Well, we've explored a lot about Roku today. Hope you found it insightful. And remember, the world of streaming, it never stands still. So stay curious, keep digging, and we'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.